I just want to take a minute to introduce myself. I'm Chris Berry. I am the new director of the Mansueto Institute. Really thrilled to be able to kick off this year in collaboration with the psychology department for our talk today. And I want to just alert you that this will be the first in a series. We have an ongoing colloquium series. A number of them are listed here. Check our website. I would just call your attention, particularly to one on October 31st, where we have somebody from Aron National Lab who's coming to talk about a really interesting project they're doing about climate change impacts around neighborhoods in Chicago. And they're particularly in Aron interested in collaborating with social scientists who work on the topic of decision making. And I figured this is probably a good audience of people who likely are at least have a tangential interest in decision making. And there's funding to support this kind of collaboration. So if you're interested in things related to environment and individual decision making, come to that talk, meet Christina, learn about some opportunities to collaborate with potentially in a way that's funded. So I'll particularly plug that one, but I hope we'll see you at all of our events. And I'm really pleased to see you at this one here today to kick off the year. And I'm going to turn it over to YC to introduce today's speaker.
Hi, everyone. Can people hear me?
Yes.
It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Aron, Professor of Psychology at the University of California, San Diego. Adam received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, working with Trevor Robbins and Barbara Sakian, and his postdoctoral training with Russ Podrek at UCLA. For the cognitive neuroscientists in the room, many of you might be familiar with many of Adam's landmark contributions to our field, especially on the topics of inhibitory control and response inhibition. Adam's 2004 and 2014 TICS paper is still my go-to reference when I want to learn about inhibitory control and the lateral prefrontal cortex. And for his contributions, he has received multiple awards, including the APA, Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contributions, the Psychology, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society Young Investigator Award, and the James S. McDonald Foundation Award. And about 2 years ago, Adam made the decision to switch the focus of his research and teaching towards the social science of collective action on the climate crisis. And I remember seeing this announcement on Twitter, now known as X, about 2 years ago, and really admiring his conviction to make this pivot towards addressing a crisis of global importance, perhaps the crisis of global importance in our time. And in addition to doing research on this topic, Adam has taken on the role of being a climate activist, passionately advocating for sustainable and transformative change in our communities, both within academic institutions and also in partnership with local governments. He has been involved in campaigns on fossil fuel divestment, campus decarbonization, and also recently authored a book on the climate crisis. I make a plug that there are 15 copies that Adam has kindly gave us to give away at this event. If you want one copy, come find me after during the reception. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Mansueto for co-organizing this event with us, and also our undergrad student partners, the Environmental Research Group, which is an undergrad student organization focused on combining science and taking a data-driven approach towards creating a more sustainable future. So without further ado, before that, you might notice that Adam's not here in person. Unfortunately, he came down with COVID while he was on his train trip around sort of like the Northeast, giving talks in different institutions. So even though we are unable to have Adam join us in person today, we're very privileged to have him sort of join us over Zoom. And so without any further delays, please join me in giving a very warm UChicago welcome to Dr. Aron.
Great, thanks so much, YC. Can you hear me okay? Put your thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, very good. So, and thanks to Mansueto for co-sponsoring this. Thanks everyone for having me, and I'm so sorry I'm not there with you. That was a big train trip, and it got derailed literally by COVID. So I'm feeling a little bit rough, but I think I can manage. So I'm going to talk about the essential role of social mobilization in confronting the climate crisis, which is a general topic, but I have a subheading here, what psychologists and social scientists can do, and I'll make some comments about that in the last part. So, as YC has kindly introduced, I had a career in cognitive neuroscience. I was quite successful at that, but I've completely switched away. Let me just hide the meeting controls here. And really, when I understood how serious this was, I felt I had to reorient myself. And so there's three different components to what I do. One of them is teaching. I've been teaching about the climate crisis in the psychology department since 2019, which is 4 years now. And so my sort of collective wisdom and experience is in this book. And the main reason I wrote this book was to try and lower the bar for other professors, particularly in social science, to actually start teaching about this too, in a kind of broad spectrum fashion. So it's for that, but it's also for students too and anyone else. I do research now on trying to mobilize people, and I'll actually talk about that at the end of the presentation today. And I do a bunch of activism organizing, which YC referred to, mostly in the University of California, but increasingly in the city of San Diego, and I'll talk about some of that too. So here are 5 questions I want to address, and the first part of this talk is about addressing these 5 questions, and the second part of the talk is about showing you some of the social science research we're doing, and hopefully getting your thoughts on that. And so these are the 5 questions, and I'm sure lots of people in the room know lots about these issues, but you may not have seen it laid out quite like this, and hopefully you have some takeaway answers to these issues. So the first is it enough for us to adapt, right? And, you know, when Jerry Brown, the former governor of California, apparently first understood, and I have this firsthand from one of the climate science users in San Diego, when he first understood how serious the climate crisis is, the first thing Jerry Brown asked was, how high is SFO Airport above the Bay water? Interesting response from a politician, right? So we're going to need to have cooling centers for low income people who don't have air conditioning. There needs to be all sorts of work to genetically engineer crops, et cetera, et cetera. And so the business of getting on with adaptation and resilience is happening. That is little comfort, obviously, for people in the global south who can't really adapt at all already. But I'm going to point out to you that it's not enough for us to just adapt. We have to leave fossil fuels on the ground. I'm going to talk about the urgency of that, which is very much underestimated by the policies we have in front of us. So we need to leave fossil fuels on the ground. Well, how do we do that? What are the policies we need to cut emissions? And then, as we'll all realize, that is happening to some extent, but nothing like the scale and pace of what we need. And so then what are the barriers to those policies getting implemented? And we need to know what those barriers are if we're to know what to do, both as individuals, as groups, and even as social scientists studying the problem. What are the barriers? And then I'm going to address this really important question of why should we bother acting locally when this is a global problem? Okay, so those are the 5 questions. Now, starting with the first one, is it enough to adapt? Even though everyone knows this, I think it's worth thinking about this for a minute. If we were to look at our little planet suspended all alone, as far as we know in the universe, there is a tiny little membrane that would be visible on our planet, which is the troposphere, just 10 miles thick. It would be tiny, right? And in that troposphere, there are now 1 trillion tons of carbon, 60% of it added in the last 40 years. And what that carbon functions as is a blanket. So as the infrared energy comes off the Earth's surface, some of it is captured in the blanket, and that produces heating. And that heating is now equivalent to 4 Hiroshima bombs worth of energy per second, every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And that is what is fueling these extreme weather events. So the biosphere is blinking red on just about every indicator. Obviously, we have an ecological crisis too, over and above the climate crisis, but I'm primarily talking about the climate crisis here. The biosphere is blinking red. The carbon dioxide is at levels higher than any point in the last 3 million years. Importantly, surface temperature is now about 1.2 Celsius or 2 Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. The ocean gets more acidic as the carbon dioxide dissolves. And if we carry on like this before long, we will kill most ocean life and there will be no sushi in Chicago. And the extreme weather events have increased 400% since 1980. Okay, so look at the steepness of this curve. We carry on burning fossil fuels the way we are right now. This summer, that freaked people out, is going to look like normal in 10 years. It'll be exponentially worse, right? Now, the damages are adding up, despite what economists have had to say for decades on this, that there was nothing to see here. The Swiss Re insurer estimates damages at about 23 trillion per year in 2050 if we carry on in the present pathway. The United States is about 150 to $200 billion of damages per year now. And of course, there are innumerable catastrophes unfolding, particularly in the global south. Now, the question is, how much heating are we going to have? And the first thing that's important to recognize is that we're not going to keep it to 1.5 Celsius. This keeps being held in front of us and dangled in front of us by higher ups and elites and policymakers as if it was still possible. It's not possible, right? There's about 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide to emit to have a 50% chance of keeping heating to 1.5, and we're emitting at 40 per year. So in about 8 or 9 years, we're going to use that up. So we're going to blast through 1.5 cells in about the 2032 timeframe. So the relevant thing to think about is when will we reach 2 Celsius? 2 Celsius was supposed to be an absolute upper limit. Well, of course, that depends on what we do. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report number 1 of 2022, Working Group 1. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that we get onto a medium emissions pathway. We're probably on a high emissions pathway right now. We get onto a medium emissions pathway by somewhat reducing more worldwide. We will blast through 2 Celsius in about the 2040 to 2060 timeframe. So let's say 2050. So less than 30 years from now, most of us will still be alive. Now, what's the big deal about 2 Celsius? Let's listen to one of the foremost climate scientists in the world tell us about that.
If you go past 2 degrees Celsius, then we will enter completely unknown terrain, a planet that is not even resembling our own planet, a place we haven't been in for the past 3 million years. So, we can today say scientifically, without any hesitation, that anything beyond 2 degrees is nothing but catastrophic. So of course, every 1/10 of a degree matters.
Now, notice the urgency here, right? Very dramatic things need to happen quickly now for us to not reach 2 Celsius, okay? But even more than that, consider the following issue. Actually, put your hands up in the room if you've heard about tipping points. Okay, about half, all right? So, this keeps me awake at night and motivates me because I have young children as well. And I think about the global south where I grew up too and recognize what the implications are for people. So right now we're like a little boat going down the river, humanity, and we could deflect to the side. There's some amount of heating built in no matter what we do, but no one can say what that is. Some scientists say, well, if we would completely cut our emissions right now, we would have 0 degrees heating built in. And others say if we completely cut our emissions now, we have 0.5 Celsius of heating built in. So it's very hard to say. But we don't presumably have to have hothouse planet. We would really cut the emissions, leave fossil fuels on the ground. The problem is if we keep dilly-dallying, then our little boat is going to start getting to this waterfall where it goes over. And this is the concept of runaway feedbacks being triggered. Okay, now one of the runaway feedbacks is the permafrost thaw. So there is an enormous amount of organic matter buried in the tundra. And as the ice thaws, that organic matter is exposed to the air, decomposes, releases methane, which is 88 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. That produces a lot more global heating. That produces a lot more thaw. That produces more global heating. And that is a runaway feedback, okay? Now, when is that process going to really take off? Well, we turn to science, our best guide to reality. And there are science articles about this, and it's in the IPCC reports recently too, although not in the models. Tipping points are not in the models. They're not in those future models that we see. Actually, tipping points are not in there. So they say, well, permafrost thaw is likely to accelerate around 1.1 Celsius of heating around now, but as late as 2.3, which would be several decades in the future. But our best estimate, say scientists, is it's about 1.5, which is about 2032. This should be New York Times headlines every day. I mean, people insure their houses for a 0.001% risk. We have a bullet coming at our head, okay? And this is not a question of if, it's a question of when. There's obviously uncertainty about this. Now, it's important to realize that it's not as if we get to 1.5 and it's like, boom, methane bomb goes off, game over, humanity. It would rather, what this means is we'll get to a point where the process will really start accelerating and unfolds for decades. But when that process really starts accelerating, it's going to make it very hard for us to hold any of this back, okay? And of course, there are other tipping points, such as the collapse of the Amazon and the slowing of the ocean, or the stopping of the ocean currents, which are slowing down now in the Northern Hemisphere as there's more freshwater melt, which should dramatically change the Northern Hemisphere climate hugely and almost immediately, right? So these tipping points are very serious. And what this does is impose, for me, and certainly for the climate scientists who speak about this stuff, and some of them will be very honest and open about it, and most aren't, this is an incredible urgency, where we have something like a 5 to 10 year time frame. If we're serious about the business of cutting greenhouse gases in the United States, in California and Illinois and everywhere else, if we're actually serious about that, and this is not just some gesture, then we need to do this in about a 5 to 10 year time frame very dramatically, not in 2050, not in 2060, like a lot of our goals are set as. So that's important to recognize. Now, that was sort of dramatic stuff, hold on to your chairs kind of thing. Now I want to show you something more positive, right? Which is, what do we need to do to cut our emissions? So this is a hopeful graph. Some may have seen this before. This is probably one of the more hopeful graphs humanity's seen. And this was from the IPCC Working Group 3 report of mitigation, 2022. To interpret it, note that worldwide we're emitting about 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, 40 billion tons. And so what this is showing you here is 0246 is how many gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent we could reduce if we did these things. Okay, now what these things are energy, agriculture, buildings, transportation. There are other things that are not on this graph, such as consumption reduction, which is actually in the IPCC the Working Group 3 report. I know that would be a heavy topic in the University of Chicago economics department, but actually reducing our economic growth in many ways is actually what's recommended, right, by the IPCC, signed off on by governments. And various other changes are not here, like dramatically increasing public transit and next to public housing is a very good way to reduce emissions, by the way. So there's some of these social policies that aren't in this graph. In any event, let's look at energy. Now, what blue means is that the cost of doing this is lower than the reference, which would be fossil gas. Now, that's not the case everywhere, but even in 2022, it is the case in many places, depending who controls the energy. If you scale out wind and solar dramatically worldwide at a cost that is actually cheaper than the reference, and no fossil fuel subsidies would make it even cheaper, we could get 4.5 gigatons, in other words, 10% of our worldwide emissions reduced right now with no special magic technology needed, okay? If we would do similar stuff for buildings, which is to say insulate, put in heat pumps, get out the gas lines, another gigaton. And if you electrify transportation, public transit, and private and vehicles, which is very much happening in California, by the way, but hardly evident at all in my trip to the East, then you get a bunch more. So altogether, you get about 30% of worldwide emissions could be reduced right now with the technology we already have, actually at a cheaper cost than business as usual. That's the facts. That's very encouraging. This is a consensus report of hundreds of scientists, and it's already out of date, okay? So that's a positive thing. Agriculture is important too. People often ask me about that. Changes of all sorts, they're regenerative, cutting out the beef and so forth, but this is more uncertain and more expensive. Okay, now, of course, this is all happening to some extent, particularly in China, and I'll talk about that later. In some countries like Netherlands, which have dramatically escalated recently since the Russia-Ukraine war. And, for example, you see occasional good news. Renewables in Australia are now 70% in the grid, mostly because of rooftop solar recently, which is 70% renewables in the grid for a big country is pretty impressive, right? And that is actually displacing coal. I'm sure they're still exporting coal elsewhere, but they're not burning coal anymore in Australia. So there are some positive aspects. China has installed 1,500 gigawatts of renewable energy, more this year alone than the entire US renewable portfolio. Okay, just to be clear, they're really going for it. They've electrified 300,000 buses and so forth. However, the fundamental problem we have is that the atmosphere doesn't care about renewable energy, right? It cares about leaving fossil fuels in the ground. That's what it cares about. And I'm afraid to say that all indications from the IEA, from the EIA, from the energy companies look like this, that while everyone expects renewable energies will grow substantially and quickly, and possibly more quickly than this, so will the extraction and use of fossil fuels. Now, you can just see what President Biden has done in the last year, right? If the US makes good on all the extraction that Biden has authorized now on US soil, we will account for fully 1/3 of worldwide fossil fuel use by 2050. So that's another what about China argument, okay? So the Willow authorization, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and the drilling in the Gulf is beyond anything Bush and Trump did. So we have this real problem now that we are adding renewables, but renewables are additional instead of replacing fossil fuels because we keep extracting and burning more fossil fuels. And I'll talk a little bit about that, even in the context of our campuses in a little bit. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure. Even the International Energy Agency has said this, a former mouthpiece of the fossil fuel industry. We need to retire existing fossil fuel infrastructure, even with lost value. A hard thing for your president or chancellor, whoever you have in University of Chicago, to accept. People who run hospitals. You need to take the fossil fuel infrastructure that we have down now, even with lost value. We need to contest fossil fuel interests everywhere, including in our universities, by the way. The absolutely insidious influence of these fossil interests on the professors in engineering and economics departments. I'll demonstrate some of that to you in a minute. We need to power our state and nation from renewable energy, best done under non-profit consumer-owned control or public power. I'll tell you a little bit about that. I don't have a lot of time to get into that, but it's relevant in Chicago too. And we need to fight locally for building, transit, and electric grid policies. This is not an abstract struggle for climate justice What do we want? Climate justice. This is a struggle for building electrification and for local policy now, town by town, city by city. And we need to reduce consumption. Now, the thing is that none of this is going to happen fast enough and big enough. This is really the topic of my talk, right? Without a large social mobilization. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we have to take action together to fight for these policies, to get these policies at a local level. And ultimately, it's political, right? You have to push against the policymakers, the decision makers, and the local elites to actually implement the policies that we need. That's what social mobilization means. Now, obviously, these policies are unfolding in various places in the United States to a greater or lesser degree. New York is now authorized. It's not quite laid down, but it looks close to basically be able to create laws on no new buildings of gas lines. You see that I think in Evanston. Yesterday I spoke there virtually, and then in my trip I saw in Massachusetts has some policies. We have a lot of policies in California, or promises of policies. Most of it's not implemented. So a lot of this is happening to some extent, but the problem is it's not happening enough and it's not happening fast enough. So what are the barriers? So this topic of the barriers is a long story, and I don't want to talk too long about this, but I'm going to give you some headline news, okay? Because it's important for us to then think about what can we do. So obviously, barrier one is the enormous entrenched interest that fostered denial, delay, and obfuscation. Notably, ExxonMobil and the other fossil fuel companies knew about this in the 1970s and then proceeded to systematically distort and confuse the American mind, as did the investor-owned utilities, by the way, just to be clear. And they have been stunningly successful across the United States in 2021, and this number won't be much different today. This is the Yale Climate Opinions Maps. Only 57% of American adults believe that global warming is caused by humans, pretty much the lowest in the world. It's low in Canada, Brazil, and Poland, other real fossil extraction companies. And then in China, it's like 90% levels, Europe, it's 90% levels. So this is obviously has enormous political implications, right? So that's one problem. Now, I normally show a video at this point, but I don't have time right now, because I want to point out to you that the forces, these entrenched interests, have shifted tactics now. They can no longer make out that there's no consensus of scientists or there's any doubt about the human cause. That's just not credible anymore. So now what they've done is they pose as climate solutions people. Like ExxonMobil has ads all over YouTube and on television that it does climate solutions. And so really what they're talking about, and this is very confusing to a lot of people, right? Including and confusing to the federal administration too, has allocated billions of dollars for this stuff. And including to the UC professors who are trying to take money to do this stuff, right? Which is that they're going to do carbon capture and storage. Now, I normally take more time over this, but just to make a few quick comments about this. What this means in effect, okay, is that the fossil fuel companies, the oil and gas companies, get to completely maintain their current business model, all their political power, all their economic power. Last year, they made $200 billion of profit and $44 billion of profit in the United States alone, while fracking and drilling the land in frontline communities that causes birth defects and cancers, while the fossil gas leaks out of the wellheads and pipelines, producing as much global heating as all the CO2 that's burned from methane. And they get to keep doing all of that and maintain all their political might while they promise us that they're going to fix some catalytic converters to the smokestacks so that when the fossil gas is burned, the CO2 will be captured and injected underground for 100 years. Okay? Now, every single demonstration project, there was recently a report on this 2 days ago, has failed at scale. This has never been demonstrated. In any case, it's colossally expensive. And even if it wasn't colossally expensive and it was half as colossally expensive, the money you spend doing that and trying to do that could immediately be spent on scaling wind, solar, and storage instantaneously around the country, okay? So this is a massive delaying tactic, and there's evidence that this delaying tactic is successful in escalating more extraction, okay? Ditto most hydrogen. Obviously, green hydrogen made from excess renewables is a good thing. We don't have excess renewables. So most other forms of hydrogen are reformed methane, and it just allows them to promulgate their business model. And this is very insidious, and it's working, okay? Number two, there is a failure of local politicians to make good on their nice words. Of course, there's nothing new about that, but I mean it in a specific sense, that one of the reasons the local politicians don't act is because there's a lack of public support, okay? Now, probably in Chicago and certainly here in San Diego, now we have Dems running the show, and our mayor and city council say the right thing. In fact, their words coming out of their mouths on climate are absolutely brilliant, because there's very good activists in town who've made amazing climate action plans, city council. They had a great plan in 2014. They did nothing for 7 years. they came up with a great plan in 2022. And this is beautiful reading, by the way. This says, we've got to decarbonize all the buildings in the city by 50% by 2030. The thing is, they just don't do it. And now they're being sued. Now, the reason the mayor and the city council, or the mayor doesn't allocate in his budget to do this, is complicated. Partly it reflects the power of unions and entrenched interests and the investor-owned utility. But it has a lot to do with the fact that the mayor surely doesn't feel that the population wants him to do this. If you poll Democrats in California about climate, 90% are very worried, they say. But no one's polling them saying, do you want 20% of your city budget to be allocated to decarbonize buildings? No one asked them that question, and they probably don't want that, or they don't know anything about that. So this is a really important barrier, right? Is that we need a social mobilization to actually turn out and impel the decision makers to actually do the right thing, given they say they're going to do it, okay? Now, a really important barrier is that local, state, and institutional goals are set way too little, way too late, and are usually couched in terms of carbon neutrality and net zero, which are often or usually a scam, okay? And, you know, this is a longer story. One version of this is the way the net zero concept is used internationally. And there's an amazing article that went viral here, Concept of Net Zero is a Dangerous Trap, by former IPCC chair Bob Watson and a number of scientists, in which they lay out for us that what net zero actually means is that the world is supposed to cut its emissions now and then do massive carbon removals in the future. But what those carbon removals actually entail, something like 2050, with technology that definitely hasn't been proven or scaled, is 2 times India being grown with fast-growing crops, controlled by northern agribusiness, taking land away from other people, crops that will then be burned for electricity. The electricity will be, the CO2 will be captured and buried underground for 100 years at a cost of 200 trillion. Now that, in fact, is the plan for humanity. Okay, so I mean, if you think that's a good plan, you're okay. But that is what those IPCC pathways actually are, except for 8.5, it just keeps going up. The rest of them go up and then they go like that. They go like that. That kicking down is that process. That is what's supposed to happen on planet Earth. So it's utterly preposterous. And what net zero does is to basically kick the can down the road, right? Because there's this promise that we're going to do extraction in the future, it licenses everyone to keep extracting now. Now, obviously, UK and local versions of carbon neutrality or net zero in California are not quite the same thing, but it's still the idea of basically pulling carbon dioxide out of the air using various technologies. Now, let me demonstrate to you how serious this is. You may have noticed the news last week that Rishi Sunak, in fact, was it this week? Maybe it was on Monday. I figure no, maybe it was Friday last week. Rishi Sunak of the UK has literally cancelled the UK's near-term climate commitments. And the reason he can do this is because the UK is still committed to net zero 2050. Like, it's just absolute proof and evidence that net zero functions as a delaying tactic, okay? And I was at Princeton University, and I pointed out to them, I don't think the higher-ups are too pleased with me, but, you know, this started at Princeton to a large extent. So Princeton University was a shill for British Petroleum and ExxonMobil to actually promulgate the net zero ideology all over the place, which you will see everywhere. So every time you see net zero now, you should be extremely skeptical. We should be talking about zero emissions, not net zero. Now, barrier number 4 is that our institutions and corporations, and most of the American universities, by the way, are very much in the mold of greenwashing. You know what greenwashing means is that you don't exactly lie outright, but you pose as doing climate action while actually taking actions that are completely inconsistent with that or completely inadequate. And you deflect in many ways. It's a way of gaslighting people. Now, I'm a veteran of this issue in the University of California. We have actually fossil gas burning on our campuses, as do you. And you are powering University of Chicago on fossil gas as you speak. That the lights that are on in your room, about half of your energy is from that. And burning fossil gas on your campus, by the way, okay? As to the University of California, emitting 1 million tons a year of carbon dioxide, all right? And, you know, let's just be clear. This is UCLA, a bastion of progressivism and trying to make the world a better place, educating students and treating patients. We flew drones above UCLA to access this. This is a fossil fuel plant on the roof, 300,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide at this day, at this very moment, still being issued from this monster, okay? And what the UC hoodwinked everyone about for 10 years was, we're going to be climate leaders. If you go to websites, there were sustainability websites, there'd be a picture of an African-American holding a sunflower, and UC is a climate leader. We're going to be carbon neutral by 2025. okay? Now, what that actually meant was they're going to keep burning fossil gas all the while promising to buy a lot of cook stoves in East Africa for young women like this so they don't chop down their local forest. Now, I don't even have time to get into how utterly preposterous this carbon offsets thing is, but we have, there's good news about this. So that was basically UC's climate action, and we had to do public record requests from our own institution, since it's a public institution, to show that the smokestack emissions for all 10 campuses are completely stable across time. No amount of carbon offsets or renewable energy credits make the slightest difference to the atmosphere. The atmosphere cares about smokestack emissions, okay? Now, snapshot, University of Chicago, I can't completely know what's going on there because I haven't been able to visit, but I can glean a little bit. Your endowment is 10.3 billion. You have plenty of money. And you've got two big fossil generation plants. You've got your East Campus combined heat and power plant, two 6.3 megawatt turbines. So this is probably 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide. I'll show you in a moment. It's probably quite an old system, probably near the end of its life, I'm guessing. And here's a newer one from 2010. This is, I'm guessing, your hospital system. That's what West Campus means, I think. And there's a bunch of turbines here. So I found the following graph. I think this graph only applies to the East Campus and not the medical school, which is going to be much bigger. And you're emitting about 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which isn't too terrible, Chicago, compared that you're a small school compared to UCSD, UCLA, and Yale. But most of us are at 200 or 300,000 tons. But I think if you add your hospital, you're probably going to be more like 100 or 150. So definitely lots of fossil gas being burned. Your plans are avoid emissions through energy efficiency, which is going to be difficult if you keep adding buildings, although maybe you're not adding new buildings. And then all kinds of really vague stuff, and even mention of carbon offsets. And so there's, as far as I can tell, no serious plan in the University of Chicago to actually deal with your fossil gas burning. All right, the social license is still in place. This is very important. I go in my neighborhood, right? And we have a lot of climate action here and a lot of consciousness from climate activists. But here's a garbage truck. Think green, think clean. We run on clean burning natural gas. This is extremely insidious because the public thinks that natural gas is a wonderful thing. It's like calling it natural coal. Now, it may be true from a legal point of view that natural gas is cleaner than diesel. From a local air pollution point of view, maybe that's what they mean. But it isn't true from an atmosphere point of view. And in fact, this is fracked methane gas that causes birth defects from point of extraction, that produces, contrary to Hillary Clinton's claim that natural gas was a bridge fuel from coal, lots of evidence, including in Science magazine, shows that natural gas is as bad as coal, right? For the reason that there is so much leakage from wellhead and pipeline that the greenhouse gas component forcing of natural gas is as bad as coal. Now, the New York Times is starting to do a much better job these days. I nearly fell off my chair the other day when I read the sentence, the wildfire smoke in the Canadian fires likely exacerbated by climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels. I'm like, you go, Brad Plumer. Why did it take you till 2023 to write that sentence? So that's quite impressive, that kind of active phrasing of the cause. Caused by the burning of fossil fuels from human beings would be even better, okay? But then I turned the page and there's an ad for Saudi Aramco, the oil company, biggest oil company in the world, a man holding a baby. So, you know, we need this to be like a tobacco moment, people. In fact, we've got lots of clever behavioral scientists probably in the room there at the University of Chicago. It happened with tobacco. We need this to happen with fossil fuels, and it needs to happen soon. This should just become anathema. Of course, that's difficult because most of us are relying, unless we have a lot of means, on still using and driving our cars around. But we've got to make, the public has to understand now that this is unacceptable. Now, there are many different aspects to this, revoking the social license. And I just want to point out to you that the Harvard Divest student activists had a wonderful win recently, which is they made a huge fuss after the Willow decision that Professor Jody Freeman was taking $300,000 a year from ConocoPhillips at Harvard. And so she's now resigned. I don't think from Harvard, she resigned from ConocoPhillips, okay? And so we have to be very aware of this, and it has to become uncool, okay? Another barrier, of course, is the social norms that entitle many of us to an intense sense of, or entitlement about carbon-intensive, non-essential behavior, and I'll leave it at that. You know what I'm talking about, particularly a problem for the affluent. And the affluent in the world, the top 1%, account for double the emissions of half the people in the world, okay? The top 1% account for double the emissions of the other 3 billion, right? Most of that through unnecessary and high status carbon intense behavior. And so we need some good role models to start shifting this. I'm near the end of the barriers. A really important barrier is the growth imperative. It's a long story, this. Chapter 4 is about it. This is my campus. We are a campus emitting 200,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide from burning fossil gas to this day. The chancellor could deal with this with about a $500 million investment. It's not cheap, it's not convenient, but he hasn't yet, although there's some good news about that I'm going to get to. Instead, he's raised $6 billion to expand the campus. $6 billion, okay? Many of these offices are empty because faculty never even come anyway, okay? Student housing is important, but there are other ways of thinking about this. I was at Princeton and I couldn't believe my eyes. It's a vast building site, apparently been going on for years, millions of square feet of new buildings going up. And the whole thing was emblazoned with this very strange sort of propaganda exercise that after I digested it for half a day walking around, I began to feel that everything was going to be okay myself. It says things like methods to create integrated environments in teaching, living, and learning while venturing forward to a carbon neutral campus by 2046. Princeton continues endowment $31 billion a year to burn fossil gas on its campus while adding new buildings. So this whole business of NYU, 6 million square feet of new buildings coming. The whole campus runs on fossil gas, okay? So the reason I'm telling you all of this is that it is very difficult to get off fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy if we keep expanding and growing all the time. This is like a central problem right now. And in fact, much as we may scream about the decision makers, licensing more oil and gas, and I was there in the rally in New York against fossil fuels, they will keep licensing new oil and gas if we keep expanding the economy and doubling it in 20 years, right? You're going to have to. So this whole business about the growth is a really important barrier, right? Finally, there are discourses of climate delay. Now, in my book, I make a distinction between epistemic skepticism, which is, I don't believe the human cause, I don't believe global warming is happening, or I believe it's happening, but I'm a Wall Street Journal reader and it's all good because economists say the damage will be so tiny compared to the size of our economy in 2100, so I don't need to worry. Okay, those are all forms of epistemic skepticism. But then there's a form of response skepticism, which is that, and most of the people we know probably in the room here and the people we know in common, people are worried about this. It's very stressful. They understand enough to be threatened. Maybe they don't understand enough to really be threatened, but they know enough, but they're not doing anything or hardly anything. And that's what I call response skepticism, okay? And response skepticism is sort of my problem. That's the problem I focus on. How do we mobilize people? How do we get them going? And in the book, in chapter 10, I have a whole table of discourses of climate delay. And I think you can refute all the standard discourses really well by just looking through that and thinking about it. Now, the standard one you get, sort of the more rich, elite, and powerful people are, the more commonly they will say, what about China? So what about China is a discourse of climate delay, okay? Its intended meaning is it's pointless cutting emissions here because China emits more, okay? Now let's just take a moment to look at this. China's emissions are currently greater than those of the United States, true, but not per capita, and certainly not historically per capita. So if we add up all the emissions in the United States back to the Industrial Revolution, fully 1/4 of that 1 trillion tons is from the US, divided by the population, now 300 tons per person. China, 20 tons per person. Now, not everyone accepts the argument of justice, right? All right, okay. Most of China, many of China's emissions arise from products that they are making there that they export to us to consume that count in their ledger and not in ours, such as the perversity of international accounting. Important point. China has installed over, now this is out of date, 1,500 gigawatts of renewable energy, which to be clear is 15 times the California electric grid. Okay, and this year alone, as I pointed out, more than the entire renewable portfolio in the United States in 1 year, China has, not even at the end of the year. And as the major military, economic, and political power, the United States is responsible to lead in emissions reduction. So, et cetera, et cetera. So this last is a very important point that I'm going to come back to in a moment. So you can refute this what about China business. All right. Now, what can we do? The first thing we need to recognize is individual behavior is a good thing, but it's not enough unless it's done as part of collective action. So this person's riding their bike. It's healthy, good, but compared to that diesel chugging truck is completely insignificant from an atmosphere point of view. But when they get together with a group, like happened in North Park here in San Diego, 300 people, Bike SD took over the streets, pushed the city council, planning commission, we got bike lanes, we literally make emissions go down. Of course you do, right? Bank of America Wells Fargo, Citibank, and Chase together have financed fossil extraction by $2 trillion since the Paris Accords. $2 trillion. So my wife and I got our money out of Citi and JP Morgan Chase, which was a real headache because we had a mortgage. And that's a good thing to do, but so much better if everyone we know does it, if thousands of people do it, if hundreds of thousands of people move their money out of these banks to, for example, a local credit union, these banks will stop financing fossil extraction. We will have stopped the money pipeline. There will be no tar sands extraction and more Gulf drilling, particularly with the cost of renewables right now, if the banks stop financing it. So of course, this is what we need to do, but you have to basically figure out how to mobilize people en masse to do this in a synchronized fashion. You don't have beaches where you are, but you have single-use plastic. And this is not about beach cleanups. It's not about single-use plastic, and it isn't really about composting, although all of those things are important in their own right, and composting is important because there are a lot of emissions associated with it. But this is about leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And I've come to think, particularly among student groups and schools, right? Everybody in California is doing beach cleanups. All the kids go off and do beach cleanups. This is literally a form of gaslighting the population to channel their concern about the world into something that's completely immaterial, almost completely immaterial to the matter at hand, which is a confrontation with the fossil fuel industry, okay? It's a political struggle. Now, small groups of people can have a dramatic impact. And let me tell you a little about the UCSD Green New Deal, which we started in 2019. And the UCSD Green New Deal, at its core, has never been more than 20 or 30 people. Out of a university of 45,000, and out of a UC system of 500,000. Now, we have had allies on the other 9 campuses, but never very many. This little band with its allies has been sufficient to completely change and reorient the climate policy of the entire 10 campus University of California, okay? In our local campus, we demanded teach climate crisis and justice to all, and I'm happy to say in fall 2024, there will be a general ed requirement on climate for 35,000 undergrads. Woohoo, okay? That's not going to be the climate education I would hope, but it's a step up, and now it's up to the students to put pressure on the professors to start producing good classes. We asked for the UC system to reject carbon neutrality for fossil-free campus energy, and I'm happy to say we have slayed carbon offsets in the UC system. Okay, we've made the higher-ups, the president, the chancellors, the CFOs have all understood that carbon offsets are bullshit. They're not going to spend any money buying them anymore or promising to buy them in the future. And instead, they've allocated $13 million for electrification planning of all 10 campuses. So all 10 campuses are now in the process of getting engineering firms to make plans of how to get off the gas, which is not the same as getting off the gas, but it's an important win, important first step. And we have had campaigns to cut ties with fossil finance that has multiple components. I'll just show you one of them here.
We need you to move the money.
Hey, Chase, this ain't funny.
We need you to move the money.
Chase Bank, you know how.
Stop funding pipelines now.
All right, Chase Bank is gone. We chased it out, okay? It's no longer in the student center. All right, now what can you do? In your school, you can go after your fossil gas plant and student activists. That's a very good thing to do. Find some faculty to support you. Faculty, you can do a petition through the Senate, make a big fuss about it. Your very rich institution should be ashamed of running its power generation on fossil gas. I mean, if the University of Chicago, just think about this. Think about your city. Think about the appalling state that Illinois is in with respect to the renewable energy transition and the buildings and the whole thing. If the University of Chicago cannot actually do this, do you think the rest of the city and state is actually going to get off the gas? Put your hands up. If the University of Chicago would be a leader and strike out and make this part of their purpose and make the investments and lead the way and get its scientists and engineers on board, do you think it would be helpful for the rest of the state? Put your hands up. Yeah, of course. All right. Banking. I bet you're using those 4 banks. Social license. I don't know anything about your profs there, except I would imagine some of the economists and people in social sciences are quite up to their eyeballs in fossil dollars, and there should be conflict. At the minimum, there should be disclosure resolutions and conflict of interest, and there should be more too, okay? It makes faculty very nervous to talk about this. They're like, academic freedom, academic freedom. All right, okay. Outside your institution, get in front of policymakers together, change the public, show the people of Chicago and show your legislature and your governor that people at the University of Chicago are at the forefront together, right? With expertise, okay? As a citizen, be a communicator. A lot of the stuff I've talked about the barriers is basically friends and family. People don't understand these things. They don't understand about natural gas. They don't understand about net zero. In your home, less relevant to students, of course, you can electrify. It's difficult in those northern climes to deal with heating, I know that, but everything else, gas water heater, electric stove, you can totally get off the gas, and you can put residential solar on, and you have very little of that in Illinois, and you could change it quickly. Shift your personal banking, reduce consumption, particularly obviously less meat eating is very significant. And above all, get with a local group and do collective action. Support statewide policy, local policy, fight for community control, okay? Snapshot Illinois, it's appalling. You've got 14% of your energy from renewables, one of the lowest states, okay, of all. Then most of the red states are way ahead of you. Many of them are. 14%, right now most of it is wind, 7 gigawatts, okay? The amount from solar is absolutely pitiful, and yet a simple search of Google Project Sunroof shows that you have 44 gigawatts potential on your rooftops. These are the major rooftops, right? No transmission lines needed. You don't need to build transmission lines. You can just put residential solar on your rooftops and have up to 44 gigawatts potential, which would completely boost your renewables very quickly as well. You have a lot of nuclear, as much natural gas as nuclear, and so the nuclear you would keep. I'm an advocate of maintaining nuclear. I'm not an advocate of building new nuclear, which is ridiculous. But you could certainly reduce your fossil burning component quite quickly in Illinois by scaling rooftop solar, which works even in northern climes. You should plan to retire, in my opinion, your campus fossil infrastructure. The higher ups will say, oh, no, we can't do that because there's not enough renewables in the grid. Well, by the time they make their plans and by the time they start digging and replacing the 19th century steam architecture with low temperature water and putting electric chillers and geothermal, it'll take 5 or 6 years to do that, by which time hopefully you'll have much better renewable standards in your state. You should fight locally for building and transport electrification in your areas and renewables policy and deployment in the state. Okay, you need renewable standards. You have a much better governor and alignment with your legislature lately, I understand. And a really important issue is to recognize, I don't have time to explain this, and I want to move on to other issues now, but just to say that it is absolutely imperative to understand, and we see this in California, I could provide a lot of evidence for this, that if the renewable energy transition is unfolding under investor-owned utilities for profit, it is going to be way more expensive and way slower than if you have local community control. And in fact, you have a nice struggle in your city of Chicago right now to democratize ComEd, which is much detested. And your city council could actually decide to take it over and municipalize, which would be a very good way to scale renewables, by the way. I'm just putting that in your minds if you haven't thought about that. Okay, now, is it worth acting locally? All right. I wrote an article about this. If you're interested, 3 reasons, local activism. You can put that on Google. And this is a PhD student from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, by the way, at one of our rallies. And I get into this in some detail. So I'm just going to give you a few highlights here in a few minutes. First of all, there are very good reasons in the United States to believe that local action leads to national change. One of the most famous examples is Richard Nixon's era. This deeply conniving and certainly non-environmental president brought the most far-reaching environmental legislation the world has ever seen, okay? Now, why did he do that? Because town by town, city by city, people clamored against pollution. And that became so onerous for the corporations that they demanded federal regulations. That's how you got the Clean Energy Acts, okay? From the corporations demanding from the Fed some standardization. It's a very interesting history. If you look at the same-sex marriage struggle, in 2015, the Supreme Court rules, boom, law of the land. Now that was preceded, that's the end now. That's preceded by decades of hearts and minds struggle, city by city, town by town, family by family. And that's where we are with our struggle to get off fossil fuels. Unfortunately, we don't have decades. We have a short time frame now, 5 to 10 years. But that's the kind of struggle. That's how social change is made. Now you could say, Adam, I understand all of this, but the climate is different. Is it? Is climate different? Let's look at some examples. So there's this policy called community choice aggregation, which I don't have time to explain right now beyond saying it's a way of allowing residential owners to make sure that some of their dollars go towards renewable energy purchasing, not for profit. It is not a policy that is working as it was designed. It's sort of failing in California in various ways I don't have time to get into, but it's still a very good idea. And it doesn't erode the point I'm trying to make here, is that 5 people in Massachusetts and Cape Cod started the struggle for community choice aggregation 15 years ago. And do you know how many Americans now have access to this policy? Of over 100 million, okay? So, you know, local activism change leads to policy that scales nationally. There's a nice example. The governor of California brought the EV rules that mean by 2027, 35% of all new sales have to be EVs, and by 2035, 100%. New York follows suit. Massachusetts will probably follow. You guys might follow, right? Of course, it goes like this. And now here's a nice example. You do not need to like AOC or Sanders to appreciate the point I'm trying to make here. In 2018, the Sunrise Movement youth, okay, the youth in the Bronx, supported by others around the country, they pretty much got AOC elected to Congress, okay? So AOC goes to Congress and she becomes a champion for Green New Deal. And that gets inherited by Sanders, who came up with a truly enormous plan of $16 trillion over 10 years, which is actually the kind of thing planet Earth would actually need, by the way. And that, of course, didn't make it. And so it got squeezed down ultimately into the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act has lots of bad components, like sweet pills for the fossil industry to expand, but it obviously is a very good thing. It's up to $1 trillion of tax credits to private capital mostly that will accelerate the renewable transition. So we'll take it, okay? I also want to point out that the Inflation Reduction Act is protectionist. It violates World Trade Organization rules, but because it's the United States, nobody can do anything, okay? Nobody can do anything. If this was India or Canada, they'd be completely hammered. They can't do anything. And it is causing the Canadians and the Europeans to absolutely freak out. VW is now building factories in America instead of Germany. And all the scientists and engineers are jumping to the United States and leaving their countries. So it is triggering green industrial policy in Canada and the US. But why would one be skeptical that getting involved in a local struggle doesn't lead to wider changes? There's a very nice arc that goes through this. Obviously, there's other factors too. Now, whether your particular local struggle has national or international significance is hard to know, but of course, this is how change is made. All right, now let's summarize. Is adaptation enough? No. We have to leave fossil fuels in the ground. We risk physical tipping points that could escalate runaway feedbacks and produce truly dramatic and horrifying changes to our world. I mean, I honestly think, based on the evidence I've shown you, plus more too, that we face a disruption of organized existence within a matter of decades, right? Everyone around me is busy putting sunscreen on their kids to protect them from a hypothetical risk of skin cancer in 40 years. I'm like, wake up. You know, I don't say that to them. It's like the Don't Look Up movie, right? So we need to leave fossil fuels in the ground. We have very concrete policies to do that. We know what they are. They're not even particularly expensive compared to business as usual, but they are highly inconvenient. And some of them are very expensive, like building electrification is going to be colossally expensive. Think about the whole of Chicago being replaced. Every building has to be insulated. Every gas line has to be taken out. Some of it will be expensive, but many of the core things are doable. What are the barriers? Numerous. What can I and we do? You can do many things. Ultimately, you can bat for local policy as a group. Why is it worth is it worth acting locally? Of course it is. And if you doubt that, sometimes you should ask yourself and say, well, what does Mother Earth need of me? You know, I mean, the Poles and Jews didn't fight the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto because they thought they were going to win. They knew they were going to be crushed. And they didn't fight the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto and say, well, maybe we should take our arms down because we're not sure that the Allies are going to win on the Western Front. Of course not. It's a matter of dignity to struggle for your world. So you can sort of, in a way, put the question of success to one side and just say, what's the right thing to do? Now, I'm going to shift gears now for the last 10 minutes and shift to this topic of what can social science and academic psychologists do. And I want to just start out briefly by saying, you know, in terms of my book, I get into this in several different chapters. In chapter 4, there is the whole topic of degrowth is introduced, which I touched on a little bit before. But there needs to be a sea change. And students, instead of getting this diet of standard economics and this kind of assumption that everything must grow and get bigger all the time, people really need to start thinking less in terms of growth and start thinking in terms of planetary sufficiency and human well-being, right? In fact, you can have steady-state economies. There have been many examples of steady-state economies, and you can have all sorts of policies that actually take the pressure off people so they don't have to keep consuming so much. So there's a really interesting role here, particularly for social science in thinking about, teaching about, and investigating degrowth. In chapter 5, I talk about more psychological topics of skepticism and motivated cognition, and how do you budge people out of epistemic skepticism. There's a whole literature on that I talk about there, and it's something psychologists can think about. Related to that is science communication. You know, you may have seen, like I've shown you graphs and uncertainty, and since many of you are scientists or academics, all of you are, you're used to seeing stuff like this, and maybe it's digestible to you. But it's not digestible to the general public. There's a really critical role here for people with visual cognition expertise, graphic expertise, storytelling expertise, to find ways to convey to the wider public what the science is actually telling us, even and particularly since it's often uncertain. Okay. And then there's the topic of threat perception. You know, in many ways, this is a tricky issue. If you take a static audience and you just lay on the kind of stuff I did at the beginning, and maybe someone with more authority than me does it, although I think we all could have the authority by just reading the IPCC reports right now. I don't think you need to be a climate scientist to talk about this stuff. But you can find a bona fide climate scientist telling the general public, wake the fuck up, people, there's collapsing this and that. Now, if you do that too much, then people are going to like not want to hear, they're going to shut down, okay? So there's a sort of sweet spot here of actually being able to communicate threat in a way that people can understand, which is a kind of a science communication issue, and coupling it somehow with messages that make people feel that they can do something and be hopeful. Now, we need to figure out how to do that, right? This is a critical issue. So there's the topic of elevating threat, which overlaps with emotion psychology and cognitive psychology and many things. And there's, of course, a clinical psychology topic of climate anxiety. So hopefully I've given you a number of sort of pointers. There's many ways that social scientists and psychologists can kind of access this space. Now, what I'm going to talk about now in about these next 8 minutes is social mobilization. Chapter 10, how do we get more people socially mobilized? Okay, now, apologize for this horrible figure. I didn't make a nicer one yet, but this comes from the book. And there is a large literature on the psychology. Let me just go back a step. The psychology of collective action, which is to say, there were several decades of studies done of anti-racism, environmental activism, anti-nuclear, but almost all of it is completely cross-sectional. It's always self-report. It surveys large numbers of people and measures various psychological variables. And it's not about the climate crisis at all, okay? But nevertheless, if you look at that literature and you say, well, you know, why do people actually say they join groups? Then you will find three things keep coming out. This is the Simca model for those of you who know this literature. Collective identity. I feel connected to my group, which is struggling to do X. Collective efficacy. I believe my group's actions will increase the chances of the decision makers doing something. Efficacy, right? And a deep sense of injustice, right? I was struck in the March Against Fossil Fuels in New York by some of the youth literally jumping up and down with rage. It was quite a thing to behold. I took some video of it. Tax the rich, tax the motherfucking rich, tax the rich. And there was a very palpable sense of complete betrayal from the Biden administration and the complete betrayal from the higher ups of society, because people understand that we're headed to an apocalypse here if we carry on like this. And yet all around there's just more fossil extraction being licensed and the whole thing just keeps running. So the sense of deep injustice is what motivates people to join collective action groups. Now, there are a number of other variables in all of this, okay? Faith in institutions is important. What I mean by that is, if you're a Trotskyist, then you don't do any climate action. In fact, I know some Trotskyists and they just laugh at me, so I'm not friends with them anymore. Okay, they're like, so endearing that you try so hard, Adam, you're completely misguided, you need the workers' revolution tomorrow. I'm like, good luck with that. So they're not going to do anything. And the other side of that is people like this sort of milquetoast Dem type, who's going to be like, it's just the Republicans. If we didn't have the Republicans, everything would be okay. So they're not going to do anything either. So you have to kind of be in the sweet spot, right? Where it's like an inverted U and you're up at the top. You have to believe this is a rotten system that is undemocratic, that is failing us. However, through concerted action, you know that you can change it too, right? So in other words, it's a kind of diagnosis that puts you in the spot that it makes collective action amenable. And then you have to believe in local theory of change, which rather few people do, but I gave you some compelling evidence for that. So there's a sort of constellation of various psychological and sociological variables that determine whether or not people are going to mobilize. Now, if you were really to design a strong study to sort of understand the psychology, because, you know, in some ways you could say, oh, you know, there's no point studying this stuff. We don't have enough time to study this stuff. Let's just do it and mobilize. And I'll say, well, yeah, we should mobilize and get out there. But at the same time, it would be good to study it because clearly whatever the mobilization is not working. It's not big enough. So let's try and understand it a little bit more. So if you were to really design a strong study to test what are the psychological variables that relate to whether or not people act and join activist groups, then you might do this. You might have group one, where you would measure a whole bunch of variables, affect, collective efficacy, social norm, identity, these things I told you about. You would measure activism behavior. It might be hard to do that objectively at baseline, but you'd have to maybe take their word for it. You would give a real intervention of some kind. In effect, I do that with my class. And then you would measure activism behavior. And then you would have a control group in which you would measure all of these variables. You would give a control intervention, and then you would measure them again, and you get activism behavior. And so you're on the activism behavior be on the y-axis, before and after, and you would predict real would increase activism behavior compared to control. And if you did that, congratulations, you do something almost no one ever did on planet Earth, which is you'd have a social psychology study that was causal. This is as causal as it could get. It would not be self-report because you could verify activism behavior by methods I'll tell you in a moment, and you would have a climate focus. Now, I'm happy to say we did something fairly close to this, okay? Not exactly the same, but fairly close, and that is this paper over here. And this is actually a registered report, by the way, so YC, you may find it interesting that I did over 100 publications in my neuroscience career, and I never did a registered report, and the first one in the space was a registered report. For those of you who don't know, this is a very interesting thing where you submit your paper to the reviewers with everything in it except the results, because you didn't run the study yet. And they, in principle, accept your paper for publication, no matter how it turns out, as long as you do what you said you would, which is a good way to do science. Now, what happened with the study is I think it's a good study, it's methodologically sound, but it didn't really work. What it did was we advertised on campus, hey, students, do you want to be in a research study and earn some money? Yeah, I want to be in it. And then we basically tried to turn them into climate activists. And a couple of them, about 5% actually sustained, it wasn't complete failure, about 5% did become, which isn't too bad. But at the end, what I understood, and they actually told me, Prof, we're worried about our world, we get it. But if you want us to do this organizing stuff, you're gonna have to pay us. So these inadvertently turned out to be the most harried and stressed students of all, the ones that are actually working jobs and in school, who actually wanted $100 to be in a research study. So it was sort of a mistaken premise in a way that we could just generally activate the population in that way. So what we did is we shifted gears, and this is a postdoc who's been helping us, and a wonderful undergrad who's really firecracker. By the way, apart from being in school, she's responsible for managing the teams in San Diego City that scaled out green composting bins to 1.8 million people. Isn't that amazing? While she's in school and while she was doing the study. So what we did now was we advertised all over the campus. Are you worried about climate change and wish you could do something about it? Participants need for a research study, IRB approved. Participants in the study will attend workshops that bolster the skills needed to enact effective collective action. Workshop topics: how to reduce on-campus fossil fuel burning, personal fossil-free banking, food waste mitigation, earn $100, blah, 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 blah. So they had to turn up every week for 2 hours in a classroom to go through this workshop training, okay? I want to point out something really important here, which is that everyone understood that to get paid, and they were not doing this for payment, by the way, you can imagine, but to get paid, they had to turn up at the workshops on Tuesday nights. But anything they did in between, any homework, any actual activism or social engagement was voluntary, okay? So the design was we recruited people, we screened them, they believe in human heating, they believe in human cause of heating, believed in threat, had not done collective action before. We measured a number of surveys before and then after, and we measured what happened at 6 months and objectively verified what they said, right? And we put them in this intervention where we specify a goal for action, a campaign, and we give them some training and they might go out and do something, all right? Now, I haven't explained this. I mean, this is kind of new results we just got a few days ago, really. So forgive me for not explaining this very well. And this looks very daunting, but it's a recurring motif, okay? So imagine your YC is the participant. Okay, welcome everybody. Hi, YC, you're in food waste group. Okay, listen up. Your campus is dumping all the waste in a hole in the ground, emitting 16,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. There's alternatives, such as purchasing an anaerobic digester. What would you do, YC, to galvanize your campus to make that change, right? And so you would write down your plan on Qualtrics. You would get large group instruction. All right, listen up, everybody. Here's strategy, here's tactics. You sort of explain to people the principles of organizing. They then debrief with their group. They go through a whole lot more stuff. They specify their homework. Okay, YC, here's a link. What, after are you going to do anything for the next week? What is it going to be? Okay, and then you might do something and come back. Okay, what did you said you would do this. What did you do? What didn't you do? What are your reasons for and against? Okay, and then you get assigned to a different group and then it rotates through the 3 campaigns. We're sort of measuring change across time in people's ability to plan, but also to act, and in particular, the reasons for acting, okay? So explaining all of this to you is a long story, and I don't want to get into all the details. I'm just going to show you one kind of result, which is the results for action, okay? So what we wind up with is action, action, action. So we wind up from YC with 200 words here, 200 words here, 200 words here for the 3 different campaigns. which are reasons for acting, reasons against acting, and so forth. And then there's this method of using human coders. So through a method of sort of subsets of data are used to derive themes. And then themes are, I think there's 11 themes, I'll show you in a moment. And then the coders get subsets of the data, and we test inter-rater reliability, and then they take the whole data set and they start coding themes, okay? So sort of chunking what people mention into concepts, okay? Here's what it looked like, by the way. Participants in their different groups. They jumped out and did amazing things. One group created a clean banking workshop. Within 1 week, Instagram flyer, advertised all over the campus, put on a Zoom to teach fellow students how to move their money out of the bad banks within a 1 week period voluntarily, okay? Collective efficacy went up. Self-efficacy went up with effect size of about 1.0. Sorry for the ugly graphs. One of the participants, just an example, about 6 of them demonstrated after 6 months that they were involved in organizing. I worked with the grad union environmental justice team to do this, blah, 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 whereas before the workshop, he'd done nothing, okay? I'm going to show you action now. So here, action, action, action. So here are the reasons that were given. Feasibility of task, external constraints, time constraints, group coordination, social obligation, yada, yada, yada. The ones that are most common explanations for why I did act was social obligation. This is important. I signed up to complete those tasks, and I knew there would be people from my group counting on me to complete them. I did it because I strongly believe the flyers would get lots of attention. Reasons against action, interesting. Group coordination. I was also not aware of the active Slack where some people in the group accomplished. So poor coordination of the group was a reason not to act. Strong sense of social obligation was a reason to act, and various other variables. We reduced the number, so we can't put everything in the model. We have to have at least 15% mentions. And we run a general linear model where basically it's homework extent, the week, 1, 3, 5, the feasibility of tasks, time constraints, group coordination, various of those variables. And we ask which of those variables explain whether or not people did their homework, okay? Whether or not they acted. Here's what we find. So social obligation. Now, the postdoc felt we had to do a Bonferroni correction, which seems like to me a little excessive. But anyway, so it has to pass 0.007. So social obligation stands out. I guess homework extent. So the more difficult the homework, the less likely you were to act. Makes sense. The social obligation is interesting, right? I signed up to complete those tasks, and I knew there would be people from my group counting on me to complete them. So that's the kind of experiment we're doing right now. Whether this is worth doing on planet Earth and the time scale we have to act, I don't know. You can tell me. But I think this is quite interesting, because what we're doing here is we're now actually making social change in the world on a campus. We're scaling this into other schools now at the same time. People are developing skills, and we're going to get better at training them to have those skills. And we're able to quantitatively measure, at least to some extent, the psychological and other variables that relate to whether or not they act, which I think is quite impressive if we can elaborate this. And if any of you are interested in being part of this kind of research, reach out to me, because we want partners. So I think I've explained all of that. Okay, last slide. This is the last slide. So some of you are, well, you're all concerned about this, which is why you're there in the audience. And I know a lot of people feel fatalist and doomist and overwhelmed by this problem, and it is overwhelming. But everyone can get involved. YC got involved by just putting on this event. Isn't that amazing? And all sorts of people do all kinds of things. I would encourage you to think about what brings you joy. Okay, what do you enjoy doing in this world? And then think about what skills and resources you have. And then think about what do we actually need to do. I've given you a lot of ideas now about what we need to do, which is basically a struggle for local policy implementation. So find your sweet spot. Let me give you an example. There was a young woman in one of my classes who's a very introverted and shy person. She is definitely not a leader. She is not an organizer, but she's a graphic designer. And she jumped into our local organization, and she started producing these amazing graphics, such as UCSD burns frac methane. A massive banner. Imagine how proud she feels when 300-400 people at a rally with news helicopters are busy photographing her banner that's displayed across the whole thing, okay? And then she designed another banner. Chancellor Kozler, commit now, fossil-free UCSD by 2030. And I'm happy to say that after 4 years of struggle against this man and his administration, after endless pressure from faculty and students, embarrassing op-eds, flying drones over the freeway, photographing the banner, shouting and screaming and banging drums, he finally said a few months ago, it is my hope, my dream, my desire, by 2030 we'll have an all-electric campus. So thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to questions.
very big thank you to Adam for a very passionate talk. We have time about, I would say, 15-20 minutes for questions. I'll moderate, so if any questions, raise your hands and I'll call you out in the audience. I can start with one. So looking at your study, it really reminded me of, like very old studies by Kurt Lewin and sort of like during the war, trying to get people to eat sweetbread. It's almost essentially, I would say, a very similar design, just ported into the modern century, our current times with a new sort of like crisis at hand. And I guess part of my question is why do you think like sort of like that knowledge, that sort of like what we learned from that kind of like experiments 50 years ago hasn't really been embraced and translated into sort of like the way that we are thinking about handling this crisis now. Now, back in that time, the military was involved too, and through their sort of like involvement was part of what got sort of like the resources to kind of scale it out. And I wonder if sort of there's something that is similar here, where instead of just doing this in schools, like with limited resources from sort of like being an academic, like, is there any way to sort of like scale it up in a way that actually gets buy-in from like organization with bigger resources? So two questions essentially. One, feels like something was not, taken from the past. And then the second thing is, how can we replicate the success that they did almost like 50, 60 years ago?
Yeah, what a great and deep question, YC. So, first of all, I never heard of Kurt Lewin until I gave this a presentation somewhat like this. I think it was at Princeton or somewhere else last week when I was on my train trip. And someone came up to me and said the same thing. There's this guy, Kurt Lewin, and he did this, and you should know about that. So what this shows you is I'm not a social psychologist. I don't know this literature. And I need people to jump in and help. Now, I don't want to offend anyone by saying this, but I'll say it anyway. I cannot find any social psychologists who are interested in dealing with the climate crisis. Certainly not the ones in my department, okay? There is no one in my department who will help, okay? And I went to Berkeley, UCLA, up and down. They're busy doing other stuff. Yeah, so we need to absolutely retrieve the wider literature, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a much richer literature that can better inform what we're doing. So I want people to help with that. So that's point A. Point B, YC, is very fascinating. You're sort of asking, like, given such expertise and knowledge exists, and in fact, we did it before. And by the way, just to be clear, think of what happened in the United States in World War II under capitalism, a massive societal reorganization that was tolerated by the populace, that involved rationing and requisitioning, and people went along with it. So I think your wider question, YC, touches on some deeper issues in the sort of structure and nature of academia. I will point out that the UC allocated $100 million recently, the University of California, for more climate research. I didn't even apply. There is no way they were going to fund research on social mobilization. I thought, or I believed. And that's certainly the case for NSF and NIH. You have to be quite careful. You can see with the government agencies how you would frame such a study. It would probably not be acceptable, right? So I think, ultimately, we're in the domain here of labor organizing and all sorts of kind of attempts to really challenge power structures. I mean, that's really what's happening here with the workshop with the students. I mean, they don't like injure anybody, and but they may shout, they may get out there, and they basically confronting their administration on its complicity, and they're learning how to do that, and we're training them how to do that, and that is something that is not going to sit well with standard funding bodies or institutions. And I think, YC, you're asking, how do we get an institutionalized version of power struggle confrontation? I just don't think society works like that. That would be my answer, although it would be nice. That would be a rational allocation of resources in the United States to basically recognize that you need a system-wide mobilization. Now, Biden did throw a few bones to the furious youth last week, and one of them was that he agreed finally to the Sunrise Movement's demand for a civilian climate corps, which is kind of something they've been asking for a long time, which is a New Deal era. Remember the New Deal, you had millions of people put to work fixing parks and stuff. So, in some ways you could say the federal government has now basically flagged for the youth that having sort of climate-related careers is acceptable, but that's not quite the same as figuring out how to produce a social mobilization. So I'll stop there, but it's a really great questions, by the way.
Yeah, thank Thank you. I was just gonna add, like, I in my class, I have a section on Kurt Lewin. I actually think I'm gonna like add on your study as sort of like, here's what we do now. So it's pretty.
Well, better still would be to communicate with, send me the slides about Kurt Lewin and try and help me know about the stuff.
Good. Ina, do you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Your study was super inspiring and interesting. I was wondering if you were surprised by the students' reasons for taking action, because you could imagine that the most predictive reasons would be ones about making a difference in the world, or wanting to stop these existential threats to the environment, but rather they're caring about how they look to their peers and not letting their peers down. Which the reasons, and that reason was the social obligation that they feel to their peers was most predictive. And so were you surprised by that?
Yeah, very interesting. So, I think this has a lot to do with the way, by the way, like YC here, I mean, I spent my career doing experiments where there were two groups of people. They were randomly assigned to the groups, and one got the brain stimulation here and one got the brain stimulation here, and everything was perfectly controlled. And so now we're in this world of like, how would you slice the joints on this thing? It's like completely intractable. And so to some extent, what we're doing, to answer your question, is we're narrowing in, right? Remember, what's happening is you get your link, and your link says, last week you said your homework was X, Y, and Z. So now tell us what homework did you do, and what didn't you do, and what were your reasons for, and what were your reasons against. So the way the thing is structured is very tight in a way. It's very tight to actually getting the reasons for and against the actions that they might have done during the week on the campaigns they've been assigned. And because we're asking those things so tightly, the kinds of explanations they're giving us are pretty tight to that point. And so it's all about whether or not they acted. Now, what of course, we could measure anything we wanted to. And you are touching there on really interesting issues about sort of probing them in a deeper sense or in a wider spectrum sense about why they're even there, or why is it that you felt that these actions you did were worth taking? We didn't quite ask that, but one could ask that. And there were answers a little bit like that buried in. They literally said things like, I didn't do my homework this week because I didn't believe this would make any difference. They literally said stuff like that. But then sometimes they would say stuff like, no, I felt this was super important. It's a very interesting thing because people have to believe that they're getting out there during that week with their peers. Obviously, they're not going to change the cogen plan. They're not going to stop the chancellor, right? But they felt that that's worthwhile doing. And that because the actions they did in that week were small, they were part of a bigger pattern. I feel like there's an enormous richness of things we could probe psychologically. I think that's what your question's getting to. So I would, thank you.
We have a question at the back first. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about to what extent in your work with students, the question of doing with less comes up, and how that is that even broached? Because I think of even things like universities flying students around the world for study abroad. Like, who's going to be the first institution that says, no, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to find other ways? And that it's like one small piece of it, but it's a necessary piece, and it is about doing less, and like how that, because that's a psychological question as well as a resource question.
Totally agree. It's something that is completely left out of the Inflation Reduction Act and all the green energy, green growth boosterism, right? We need consumption reduction. We have to think differently about our economy and in terms of sufficiency and human well-being. And, I don't have, it's such a long conversation to have, and I don't have a lot of answers for you right now, but just to say, it's hard. There's a wonderful paper by, so one of the wonderful economists is Julia Steinberger, and she's in Lausanne. She's an ecological economist. There are not many of those. And her whole research is about this topic, by the way. And they have one paper called Scientists' Warning on Affluence. And there's a paragraph in that paper that really struck me. And I sort of was thinking about my wife when I read it. My wife's a wonderful person, but she's kind of locked in the kind of rat race that they describe there. They describe how no matter what your ideology and your principles, as a working parent, or whatever, like she's a doctor and a mother, right? You're locked into a kind of competition with everyone else around you. Everyone needs to have a car to get to work on time. Everyone needs a smartphone and the latest smartphone to kind of keep up. And You need a lot of like ordering and processed food so you can maximize the amount of time you spend working. And really what that ends up doing is forcing people into this kind of hyperconsumption circuit. She described that very well in the paper. And I feel like, that's what's going on. And the question is, how do you break the society out of that? Now, that's where the degrowth, or I prefer the word post-growth policies come in. And this is something very hard to imagine catching on in America, by the way, but it catches on more in Europe, so much so that the Dutch Parliament recently heard testimony on post-growth policies. By the way, you should Google that, Dutch Parliament post-growth. And, some of it isn't crazy. You move to a 4-day work week, you save emissions of 15 to 20%. You have a basic minimum income, you take pressure off a lot of people so they don't have to keep scurrying around getting jobs. And a lot of the jobs require a lot of emissions, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are sort of policies that society could implement. And you can look at countries like Spain that have like a third of the GDP of the United States and much better health and life outcomes. It's not as if working hard all the time actually makes people happy or even have better outcomes. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But to say the question of how we really behaviorally change our society to actually reduce the material throughput and consumption as individuals and societies, like another whole level of challenge. And I, as a climate activist, I'm fully aware of that, but I generally bracket it. I'm like, I'm focused on the struggle around electrification, against the investor-owned utility, against the fossil burning, against the campus. Like, we've got to leave fossil fuels on the ground. That's my mission. But I'm mindful that that's not going to be sufficient. We're going to need to contend with that other stuff too. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. My question is kind of around like, as people become disinterested. So something I think about a lot, especially with like all these booms in social media, is that people can get really excited about something and then they can really lose interest very quick. And I think about like resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and you had a lot of people being mobilized, and slowly people just started falling off and just forgot that things didn't move as far. And so I guess my question is, when thinking about social mobilization, how do you deal with the issue of sustained effort, especially on people who may not be as committed or as passionate about it?
Yeah. I mean, the word burnout is used a lot, right? How do people sustain? I don't have very deep answers for you on that. Just to say though that in our organization, and we've endured, by the way, one of the interesting things about the UCSD Green New Deal is that we've endured over 4 years, and I think we're going to keep enduring, because we have a core structure that's actually faculty and some retirees and staff, and we don't leave. The students keep coming and going. We also have grad students who are around for 6 years. So many of the Sunrise Movement had this problem. The youth keep kind of disappearing and going somewhere else. So in our organization, to some extent, we try to deal with what you're talking about through I don't know, there's kind of a culture of care. There's a culture of recognizing people are tired. Please take a break, take care of yourself. There's a little bit of that. And I think, ultimately, maybe I'd answer by saying the following. You're absolutely right, whoever asked that question, that there's constantly this problem of people peeling off from these movements. But I also think that there's something very beautiful and important about being part of these movements, which is that in this sort of late stage neoliberal capitalism phase we're in, which absolutely has fragmented and atomized people, walking around glued to their phones, don't know how to talk to each other, lonely. There was an article recently about American adults are so lonely, and even more lonely because when they go to the store, they don't even interact with a clerk now. They basically just have to input the stuff to a computer, right? Or to the automated thing. So, a great antidote to that is to get in a group where people are volunteering out of love for the biosphere and taking care of each other. And so that, if the group functions well and it has sort of intelligent processes in to kind of honor people and respect them and thank them, people are going to stick with it. So that would be my simple answer. This is a challenge you brought up there for how movements need to treat people well and to keep them engaged. And I mean, again, another aspect is people leave because they don't feel it's efficacious. It's important for a group to get wins and to keep celebrating the wins and to be intelligent about choosing new campaigns and bring the campaigns before the group in a way that breaks them down. So I think well-functioning groups don't have so much the problem of people leaving. Maybe that's the way to answer it.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question. If there are any. If anyone on Zoom would like to ask a question, now is a good time to use the raise hand function, and we can sort of call on you. If not, I'd say we give Adam a big round of applause.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you everyone for attending. We do have a wine and cheese outside, right outside, so Adam can't join us, but interacting with Thank you, Adam.